The dogs and the cats and the monkeys are a lot like you. The chickens and the cows and the geese, they're a lot like me. We all just want to be. We all just want to be. We all just want to live happy and free. Hi, and welcome to another edition of Animals Have Rights. The first thing that we're going to do this week is make a little dedication. A dear friend of ours recently passed away. And so the show is dedicated to Helene Dwyer. Helene Dwyer was a longtime Alliance for Animals member. She was an outstanding activist. She passed away on Thursday, April 23rd, 2009 at Hospice Care Facility in Madison. Shortly after her retirement from many years as an associate professor of philosophy at UW-Baraboo in 2006, Helene was diagnosed with ALS. Helene was an active member of the Alliance. She worked tirelessly on many committees. She was certainly involved in feral cat issues and companion animals, and she was a dynamic part of the anti-vivisection committee. Helene will be remembered for her work and efforts, especially with cats that were suffering from FIV and feline leukemia. She often took in cats and gave them a home, cats that nobody else would have anything to do with and wanted to put down. She had a great deal of compassion for all animals, even humans, and she's going to be missed by all of us. In 2007, Helene was awarded the AFA Outstanding Activist Award for her years of dedication and service to all animals. Throughout her illness, Helene was outspoken in her conviction that even people with devastating and fatal illnesses should speak out against the use of animals in biomedical research. I got to interview Helene before her death, here in fact, and she also gave a couple presentations about researchers at the University of Wisconsin, and either this coming week or the following week we'll try to put together a compilation of those bits that and let you see what Helene herself had to say. So today's program is dedicated to Helene. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some local news, and I'm sort of stepping on the toes of our attorney here, who's going to talk about law, but I want to talk about local news, so I will. The first thing was there's been a bill introduced to regulate puppy mills in Wisconsin, and so we're going to urge you to write to your legislators today and ask them to co-sponsor LRB 2448/2. The Alliance for Animals, you can read all about this on the Alliance for Animals website. It's allanimals.org. The Alliance applauds the introduction of a long overdue bill that intends to regulate puppy mills in Wisconsin. The bill, Commercial Dog Breeders Licensure Bill, was introduced by Wisconsin Senator Pat Kreitlaw from Chippewa Falls, Representative Jeff Smith from Eau Claire, and Senator Alberta Darling from River Hills, and Representative Christine Sinicki, I hope I pronounced her name correctly, from Milwaukee. Wisconsin is one of the few states left with basically no regulation, licensing, or inspection program to enforce the basic standards of humane care for puppies being sold or of dogs used for breeding. Wisconsin has developed a bit of a reputation for its puppy mills, and has become a magnet for puppy millers from Missouri and Pennsylvania, where restrictions have made it difficult to continue with their businesses there. The legislation would require strict standards for breeders who sell more than 25 dogs a year. So please write to your legislators, ask them to co-sponsor the bill. Requests for co-sponsors should be made before April 21st. So please write, you can make a difference. The next thing that's a little bit farther reaching, this has to do with national legislation. The Grade 8 Protection Act has been reintroduced. It failed a year ago or 2 years ago, but it was after ABC Nightline's blistering expose of the new Iberia Primate Center. The Grade 8 Protection Act, that's HR 1326, was reintroduced. Right now it has 47 co-sponsors, but not one from Wisconsin. The purpose of the act is to prohibit invasive research on great apes and the use of federal funding for such research both within and outside the United States. The great apes, by the way, are the chimpanzees, the bonobos, the gorillas, and orangutans, and actually humans. It prohibits the transport of great apes for purposes of invasive research. It prohibits the breeding of great apes for the purpose of invasive research, and requires the provision of lifetime care of great apes that are owned or under control of the federal government and a suitable sanctuary through the permanent retirement of such apes. Contact your U.S. representative in Congress and urge them to sign on as a co-sponsor of this important and landmark legislation. Right now, there are 44 co-sponsors, and once again, not a single representative from Wisconsin has endorsed this important bill. So, with that, I'm going to turn the show over to Attorney Leslie Hamilton for her segment, Animals in the Law Today. Take it away, Leslie.
Thank you, Rick. And shame, shame, shame on you Wisconsin Congresspeople. This is a no-brainer. Get your butts out there and co-sign that bill to protect the rights of great apes in this country. With regard to puppy mills, as Rick said, and by the way, Rick, you can step on my toes anytime you want to. But as Rick said, we now have a bill. It doesn't have a bill number yet. It's still got the Legislative Reference Bureau number on it. But Newsweek, within the last month, had a feature story on puppy mills and named Wisconsin one of the 3 top states in the country. And this is a top state designation we don't want to have for the production of puppy mill dogs that are often sold through the large retailers or end up in the laboratories around this country. Today, my segment is going to concentrate on one case that has been decided by the United States Court of Appeals in the Third Circuit. And that circuit includes Pennsylvania and Virginia and a few other states. What's exciting about this case is that it has been appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court has decided to hear the case. It involves a individual by the name of Robert Stevens, and the constitutionality of a federal law. The federal law, which is, if anyone's interested in reading it, is 18 United States Code Section 48. And essentially that law says that whoever knowingly creates, sells, or possesses a depiction of animal cruelty with the intention of placing that depiction in interstate or foreign commerce for commercial gain shall be fined or imprisoned for not more than 5 years, or both fined and imprisoned for not more than 5 years. Now, a depiction of animal cruelty is defined by the law to include anything that you can think of that could be reproduced electronically or through a photograph, videotape, or a sound recording of any living animal that is intentionally maimed, mutilated, tortured, wounded, or killed, and someone films that act. So if you have created that film, you possess that film, or you attempt to sell that film or videotape or photograph or JIP, is that what it's called on the computer? You can be prosecuted under this law. Well, Robert Stevens was prosecuted under this law, and he was found guilty. His films were of dog fights that he staged. There were pit bulls fighting in the pit. There were other dogs that were being trained on farm animals, pigs, to hunt feral pigs. And so the films depicted the pit bulls grasping a hold of the jaw, generally, or face of the pig and ripping it off. And he was found guilty by the federal district court, which is the trial level court in the federal system. And he appealed his conviction, and his argument was to the Court of Appeals that this law violated his constitutional right to free expression, freedom of speech, in other words. And the Court of Appeals shockingly enough, did rule in Robert Stevens' favor and dismissed his conviction. Now, if you look at the legislative history of this law, you'll see that Congress's intent, although the law is broadly stated, its intent was to outlaw the creation, sale, and possession of what are commonly referred to as crush videos. And for those lucky people in our audience who have never heard of a crush video, I'll have to explain what that is. Essentially, it is a videotape of a woman's bare foot or a woman's foot in a high heel, spike heel shoe, crushing a small animal to death. And generally, these films almost never show a woman's face. It's just the woman's foot, so there's some foot fetish thing involved there. And there's the auditory stimulation for the viewer of hearing the animal's cries and squeals of pain as it's dying. So apparently, for those putative members of our species who stepped off the evolutionary path somewhere south of Cro-Magnon man, these videos are quite a turn-on. And although the acts shown in the videos are illegal in every state in the United States, and the perpetrators would be prosecuted if caught by the criminal justice system, because the woman's face is never shown, the location where the video was made is never known, and the date that the video was made is indeterminable. The criminal prosecutions simply are never successful because you have to at least give the date of a crime so someone can come up with an alibi. Here we have victims who can't testify, obviously. And actually, this is much, if you think about it, much like child pornography in that the victims are often unknown, unidentified. The films are made in hidden, secret locations. Individuals who make them are generally anonymous and sell them over the internet in an underground sort of fashion. And child pornography is illegal. That is the video depiction of a criminal act involving a child, and those laws are constitutional and have been upheld by the federal courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court. However, the U.S. Court of Appeals, as I said, for the Third Circuit, has decided that when it comes to animals being abused and even killed on tape, that society's interest in the life of an animal is not so compelling that it would override society's interests in First Amendment rights and First Amendment expression. Essentially, you can think of free speech as, as being regulated when human safety would be put at risk if it were not. For example, the common example is yelling fire in a crowded movie theater. However, if you're watching a movie about firefighters and someone on the screen, one of the actors yells fire, that's okay. If you're watching a movie about someone trying to assassinate the president and you watch them conspire to do so, that is not prohibited. But if you and I were to sit down together and try to talk about that, that would be prohibited. So there are areas of speech that are clearly not protected by law. However, what the court said is that the speech at issue here, in those cases that I've described, create a grave threat to human beings or to national security, but not to animals. And the value of an animal's life or the suffering of an animal simply does not rise to the level that the First Amendment right of an individual can step aside. And essentially what it says is the court said, is preventing cruelty to animals does not trump the right to free speech. And although the Supreme Court has permitted content-based restrictions on the right to free speech, it has only done so when the well-being of human beings are at stake and never done so to protect the interests of animals. The court said the sexual abuse of a child is a most serious crime and an act repugnant to the moral instincts of a decent people, but nothing in our country's case law even suggests that a law that restricts an individual's free speech rights will be upheld in favor of protecting an animal. So that is the case that is going to the U.S. Supreme Court and will be heard, where the U.S. Supreme Court will decide whether or not society's interests in protecting the well-being of an animal should trump Robert Stevens and others of his ilk's right to free expression. And that is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth for animals in the law today. Back to you, Rick.
Thank you, Leslie. Crush videos, that's a happy thought. Let me make a couple clarifications from last week. One of the things I talked to you about last week was this study that was from the University of Wisconsin. I don't think you can still see this, but I'm still going to hold it up because I pointed to this last time. And I told you I tried to find the date of the paper and I couldn't, so I hate not knowing the things I'm talking about. It was published in 2004, and I also couldn't find the title of the paper, but it was Novel Restraint System for Neuroendocrine Studies of Socially Living Marmoset Monkeys, and it was published here in Madison. The other thing is that I wanted to clarify was that I told you last week that I could think of 3 researchers that in fact had been forced out of the university for their concern about particularly the primate center and the primate labs because of their concern for the monkeys and how they were being used. I told you I knew of 3 of those people. Actually, I realize now I know 4 of them. And in fact, that 2 of them were veterinarians. The most recent one was Jennifer Hess, who actually the university gave her a settlement of $250,000. In fact, a little over $250,000 when they fired her because she complained about the treatment of the animals there. So they've actually got rid of 2 veterinarians who were concerned about the treatment of animals at the primate center. That's just a clarification. So now on to more current news. Unless you've been living in a cave, you haven't heard about the so-called swine flu that some people say is going to sweep the world. So I thought it was sort of interesting. I thought we might take a look at it because, there's a connection to Madison, of course, or I wouldn't bring it up. The article in the Cap Times says that swine flu scare puts spotlight on factory farms. It says that the outbreak in Mexico, critics say, is exactly the kind of public health disaster they've been worried about. This is the sort of thing that could happen right here in Wisconsin in the future, says Jamie Saul, an attorney with the Madison-based Midwest Environmental Advocates. Wisconsin has about 200 factory farms, according to this article from the Capital Times. It says that, a concentrated animal feeding operation, as the industry prefers to call them. A CAFO or CAFO is any livestock operation that has 1,000 or more animal units, a measurement of waste and manure. That translates to an operation with at least 700 cows, 2,500 pigs, or 55,000 turkeys. I thought this was an interesting quote. Claims linking the flu to Mexico's hog farms are mass hysteria, said Platteville animal sciences professor John Timby. Prices of pork are falling, and all because of pure speculation and fear. Well, that's sort of interesting. They're telling you, of course, you don't have to worry about getting swine flu if you're eating pork, but of course, that's not quite right. If you eat pork, you're supporting the people who are keeping the animals in these very closely concentrated situations, so you are contributing to the possibility of swine flu and other diseases coming our way. Now, this sounds like the ranting of an animal rights activist, and it is. But let's see what the Homeland Security DailyWire.com has to say. They're in the business of Homeland Security, they say. According to the U.S., this is the headline says, current swine flu is the inevitable result of modern farming methods. Now, this is not an article from PETA or from the Humane Society. This is from Homeland Security Daily Wire. They say, according to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, the new virus is a mixture of 4 different viruses: North American swine flu, North American avian flu, human H1N1, and a swine flu strain found in Asia and Europe. Now the propagators of the conspiracy theory argue that this new combination could not have occurred naturally. But LePage, who wrote an article in The New Scientist, points out that this isn't true. Flu viruses consisting of a mixture of human, swine, and bird strains have been found before. They go on to say that there are more than 6 billion people on the planet. Farmers raise more than 1 billion pigs and about 70 billion chickens every year, as New Scientist writer Deborah McKenzie has reported in detailed articles over the year. The article finishes up. It says, on an open range, an animal sick and weakened by a flu virus may not be able to walk or fly far, limiting its ability to infect other animals. In industrial farming businesses, in which thousands of animals are densely crowded in pens, infections spread like wildfire. Indeed, already attention is turning to the big pig farms in Mexico and the role they may have played in creating this new strain of swine flu. It's very unlikely that the swine flu outbreak is a result of bioterrorism. Accidents in medical research labs occur, but by far the most plausible explanation is that this monster is the long-predicted product of our farming system. The real question then is not why this particular incident of reassortment is unfolding. The question rather is, why has it taken so long to occur? So now let's go to Wisconsin a little bit more. Sort of interesting to me, this Wisconsin Radio Network News, I heard an interview by a researcher here who just retired. His name is Dennis Mackey. He's actually quite well known. He was involved in the School of Infectious Diseases. And Dennis Mackey says, without the vaccine, that millions more may get the swine flu. I think he's throwing gasoline on the fire, but he says that Mackey has been pleased so far with public health's response and oversight to swine flu, but would like to see a vaccine developed immediately for every person in the United States. Wow, I think that's sort of far-fetched that we're going to immunize every person in the United States. It's pretty interesting. The article and Mackey alluded to something called the last flu plague, called the 1918 Spanish flu. And this is sort of interesting, and this is why this really sort of brings it home to Madison. Is about a year, 2 years ago, perhaps, you might remember that Homeland Security wanted to build a new giant BSL-4 laboratory called the National Agro facility in the town of Dunn. This was a facility that was going to replace the an animal infectious disease laboratory on Plum Island, New York. The facility at Plum Island had become so worn out. Germs were leaking out and are leaking out of it all the time. It was so bad they thought that they couldn't ever refurbish it. They closed one of the buildings altogether, won't let anybody go inside. You can look at the data that comes from a variety of sources, and you can see that many diseases apparently have started on that little stretch of the New York coast and have spread across the United States. One of those is Lyme disease, in fact. So they were having meetings in the town of Dunn, and one of the people that came to speak strongly in support of the laboratory was Dennis Mackey. And Dennis Mackey stood up and said that he thought that they should build it there because it was going to make a lot of jobs for us here in the Madison area, and that it would be perfectly safe. In fact, he thought that he would let his granddaughter play around outside of the facility. Now, at that meeting, some people in the town of Dunn asked if any of the people who had come to talk, and the university sent, it was a panel of, oh gosh, there must have been 8 or 9 people, all experts, that the university sent to try to convince the town of Dunn that they should allow this giant facility, this BSL-4 laboratory. By the way, BSL-4 means it's the highest level of biosecurity available, and it's the sort of place that they will experiment with the most deadly diseases known. So there was talk about, they asked the people, the experts at the university, if they'd read this book called Lab 257 about Plum Island. And none of the researchers that had been there had, even though they were saying that they wanted to build this lab to replace Plum Island. They said later on there was a number of comments about the book being just written by somebody who didn't know what they were talking about, that it was all made up, it was all fictitious. But in fact, the book was endorsed by the governor of Connecticut and the governor of New York. So a few people that seemed to know what was going on, they thought it was an important work. But back to the flu. One of the things that you've read or may have heard by now was that they don't know if the new flu is here in Wisconsin or not. But I'm willing to bet donuts to dollars that in fact it is. And I'll bet you that it was sent here in the mail. And I believe that it was probably sent to Yoshihio Kawaoka's flu laboratory right over here at Research Park. In fact, Dr. Kawaoka is a well-known, internationally known, in fact, researcher who studies flu. And he was, in fact, involved with resurrecting the 1918 Spanish flu. Let me read something very quickly to you about just how dangerous flu viruses can be. This is a book called, another book I'm recommending that you read. It's called The Great Influenza, The Epic Story of the Deadliest Plague in History. Just a couple of quick passages. The lowest estimate of the pandemic's worldwide death toll is 21 million, in a world with a population less than one-third today's. That estimate comes from a contemporary study of the disease, and newspapers have often cited it since, but it is almost certainly wrong. Epidemiologists today estimate that influenza likely caused at least 50 million deaths worldwide, and possibly as many as 100 million. Normally, influenza kills the elderly and infants, but in the 1918 pandemic, roughly half of those who died were young men and women in the prime of their life. One cannot know with certainty, but if the upper estimate of the death toll is true, as many as 8 to 10% of all young adults then living may have been killed by the virus. And they died with extraordinary ferocity and speed. Although the influenza pandemic stretched over 2 years, perhaps 2/3 of the deaths occurred in a period of just 24 weeks. And more than half of those deaths occurred in even less time, from mid-September to early December 1918. Influenza killed more people in a year than the Black Death of the Middle Ages killed in a century. It killed more people in 24 weeks than AIDS has killed in 24 years at the time the book was written. The influenza pandemic resembled both these scourges in other ways also. Like AIDS, it killed those with the most to live for, and as priests had done in the bubonic plague in 1918, even in Philadelphia, a modern city, as modern a city as has existed in the world, priests would drive horse-drawn wagons down the streets, calling those behind doors shut tight in terror to bring out their dead. Now, the 1918 Spanish flu was extinct. It was wiped from the planet. There had been no instances of 1918 Spanish flu. As far as we knew, it was completely gone. So researchers a few years ago, they learned that some of the people who had died of the 1918 Spanish flu were buried in the permafrost in Canada. So they went and they dug them up. And they were able to bioengineer, back engineer, they were able to recover bits and pieces of the virus's DNA. And they have now reconstituted the 1918 Spanish flu, the most deadly disease in human history. And one of those people that were working on the recreation of the 1918 Spanish flu was Yoshihiro Kawaoka here in Madison. In fact, he was cited by the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, for doing research with the influenza virus in a laboratory that did not have adequate biological safeguards. That's why they built him, the University of Wisconsin built him this new lab out here at the University Research Park. So you can be darn sure that if a new virus shows up any place in the world, that it's being overnighted to the lab here in Madison. So the flu does have ties here, and you can be darn certain that it's right here. Well, we're getting close to running out of time, and that's unfortunate because I wanted to tell you about something that's called, and I'm going to tell you very quickly, maybe we'll get to it next week. It's called something called tactile defensiveness in young children. This is the idea that you don't like to be touched. There's children that have ADHD, Fragile X syndrome, a variety of problems that causes you just don't like to be touched, don't like anything to touch you. And that research was done, in fact, right here. Some of that research, epidemiological research, looking at over 1,300 children, was done, in fact, twins, very important research. It was done right here at the University of Wisconsin. And I also wanted to tell you, that's tied into something I wanted to tell you, was that, did you know that children that are exposed to lead have behavioral problems and it causes problems with their IQ? And did you know that, in fact, the American Academy of Pediatrics has recommended that we now spend all of our time on just trying to prevent lead exposure in young children? You might have known that. But I bet you didn't know this, that a paper was published in 2008 by Mary Schneider here at the University of Wisconsin and her colleague Nellie Laughlin, who now have said that lead exposure induces tactile defensiveness in rhesus monkeys, something we never knew. She said that there are no studies of lead exposure and tactile defensiveness in children or animals, in spite of the fact that lead exposure is also associated with inattention and emotional dysregulation. Well, we're running out of time, so I guess I'm just going to have to leave it there and tell you that next week, maybe we'll look into the fact that we're still exposing monkeys to lead and alcohol at the University of Wisconsin and look at some of the results of that.